He treated her just like a princess.
So I went and got the gun.
She's willing to risk it all to stay with him.
Love makes people do extraordinary things. Michelle Miles was 18 when she met Stanley Burrell, a man who promised her a kingdom. She cooked crack cocaine for him, packaged heroin, made drug runs while he hid from federal agents. When they finally came for her in 1997, she refused to cooperate 3 separate times. Her loyalty cost her 30 years in prison. It saved him nothing. But to understand how love became a 30-year sentence, you have to go back to the beginning. Before we dive in, take a moment and drop a quick comment. What are you doing while you listen? Driving, working, cooking, or just taking a moment for yourself? Your presence here truly matters. Just a quick note, this story includes some fictionalized details added to convey the core message. What matters most is the lesson it carries. The moment Stanley Burrell stopped in front of the bench, Michelle Miles knew her life was about to change. She just didn't know it would cost her 30 years. It was a summer afternoon in 1990. Brooklyn heat making the asphalt shimmer. Michelle sat outside the Marcy projects with friends, their laughter cutting through the street noise. She was 18 years old, a girl with dreams of college and a mother who needed her. Her father had never been in the picture, so Michelle had learned early what it meant to be unseen, to keep her head down, work hard, and hope that someday someone would notice. That day, someone did. Stanley Burrell had a reputation that preceded him. 30 years old. He was the man everyone in Marcy talked about, the one with money, with power, with a name that carried weight. Her friends barely looked up when he approached, already knowing they weren't the ones he wanted. He stopped directly in front of Michelle. "Can I talk to you for a second?" he said. She looked up, certain he must mean someone else.
Me?
She asked. The question hung there, small, disbelieving, carrying 18 years of invisibility. Stanley smiled. That was all it took. In a neighborhood where drug dealers weren't despised but revered, where hustlers had the swagger and the juice, Stanley Burrell was royalty. And he had chosen her. What does it mean to be chosen when you've spent 18 years invisible? For Michelle, it meant everything. This wasn't just attention, it was validation. Stanley didn't just see her, he wanted her. The man who could have anyone had walked up to her bench and asked to talk. He told her he'd had his eye on her, told her she needed somebody to take care of her, told her things that made her feel like she mattered. Keep that feeling in mind, that hunger to be seen. It would become the chain that bound her to him through every betrayal, every lie, every moment she should have walked away. Stanley offered to take her out. A movie, a nice dinner. Romantic, he said. Michelle, who had never been treated like a princess, said yes. But here's the thing about Marcy projects in 1990. Everybody knew everybody's business. And everybody knew how Stanley Burrell made his money. "We knew he a drug dealer. He got money," Michelle would later say. She knew. The entire neighborhood knew. The flashy car, the expensive clothes, the way he moved through the projects like a king. None of it came from a legal paycheck. Stanley was a drug dealer, and that wasn't a secret. It wasn't even frowned upon. In some corners, it was admired. The car door was open. Stanley's hand was extended. Michelle had 1 second to decide between the life she'd always known and the one he was offering. She got in the car anyway. Michelle Miles followed Stanley Burrell through the peeling doorway of the Brooklyn trap house, her sneakers sticky against linoleum that hadn't been cleaned in months. The apartment smelled like burnt plastic and sweat. 3 men hunched around a kitchen table covered in white powder. Digital scales and sandwich bags, so many sandwich bags. "This is where the magic happens," Stanley said, grinning. Michelle's stomach twisted. She'd suspected Stanley sold drugs, but suspecting and seeing were different things. Mountains of crack cocaine sat beside bricks of heroin, more narcotics than she'd ever imagined in one place. Her first instinct was to run. Stanley must have sensed her hesitation. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulled her close. "You said you were ride or die, baby. I need you." Those words melted her resistance like butter on a hot stove. "Because I was in love with him," Michelle would later explain. "I'm going to do what I can to keep it." One of the men at the table looked up. Alan Tate, a wiry guy with cold eyes and quick hands. He was Stanley's most trusted lieutenant, the one who kept the operation running when Stanley worked his legitimate security job. Alan nodded at Michelle, but didn't smile. "She cool?" Alan asked. "She's more than cool," Stanley said. "She's about to be our best worker." Here's what strikes me about this moment. Michelle didn't stumble into crime. She chose it. Love makes people do extraordinary things, and sometimes those things are extraordinarily stupid. But there's a purity to her honesty that's almost refreshing in a case file usually filled with lies. Stanley handed Michelle a stack of empty vials. "I'll show you how to package. It's easy money." For the next 4 hours, Michelle learned to measure, cook, and package crack cocaine. Her hands shook at first, but Stanley praised every clumsy attempt. By midnight, she'd found a rhythm. The work was mindless, almost meditative. "You're a natural," Stanley said, counting out $1,100 bills. "This is yours, every week." Michelle stared at the money. She made $400 a week at her retail job, before taxes. This was almost 3 times that amount, for one night's work. She thought about her overdue electric bill, her mother's medical expenses, the creditors who called daily. "He gave me $100 a week," Michelle would tell investigators years later, her voice devoid of regret or pride, just stating facts. Alan Tate packed the finished product into a duffel bag, preparing for a midnight run. "I'm taking the Maryland route tonight," he told Stanley. "Got a new buyer in Baltimore." Stanley frowned. "Stick to the usual spots. New buyers make me nervous." "Trust me," Alan said. "This one's golden." That confidence would prove costly. Alan Tate was good at reading cocaine purity, but terrible at reading people. As Alan headed toward the door with $50,000 worth of narcotics, Michelle couldn't have known she was watching a dead man walking. The golden buyer in Baltimore was actually an undercover DEA agent named Marcus Webb, and Alan Tate's next wrong turn would set off a chain reaction that would eventually bring down Stanley's entire operation. But that night, Michelle just counted her money and wondered how something so wrong could feel so right. Michelle's fist hit the bedroom door hard enough to rattle the frame. She already knew what she'd find on the other side. The trap house had gone too quiet. Stanley said he was handling inventory. The bedroom door locked from the inside. She shoved it open. Stanley was in bed with another woman. The other woman in Stanley's bed had no name that mattered to Michelle, just a face that would haunt every choice after. Young, smug, sheets pulled to her chest. Michelle lunged. "So we start fighting." Michelle would later tell investigators. They crashed into the nightstand, fists flying, nails clawing. The woman screamed. Michelle didn't. 4 years of loyalty, of packaging drugs in this apartment, of washing blood money, all of it came down to this moment. Hands grabbed Michelle from behind. Crew members pulled them apart while the woman scrambled for her clothes. Michelle's knuckles bled. Stanley sat frozen, staring at her like she was the problem. She walked down the hallway. The gun sat where Stanley kept it, the .38 revolver he'd taught her to shoot. I went and got the gun. The weight felt right in her hand. Michelle walked back. The crew scattered. The woman pressed against the wall. Stanley stood, hands up. "Baby, it's not what you think." Michelle pointed the gun at the woman. "Get out." The woman ran. Stanley stepped closer, palms raised. "She doesn't mean anything. You're the one I love. You're the one I trust." The gun trembled in Michelle's hand. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, walk out of this trap house, this life, this man who would betray her and beg forgiveness in the same breath. But the fear of losing him burned hotter than the rage. What does love have to do with staying when you're holding a gun on the woman in his bed? Stanley kept talking. He swore it was a mistake, that she was everything, that the operation needed her. He reminded her of the money, the apartment they'd just rented in Manhattan, the life they were building. Michelle lowered the gun. It was easier to stay than to walk away. She would explain years later the simple math of a woman who'd invested too much to quit empty-handed. Stanley pulled her close. She let him. This was Michelle's exit. The door was open. The gun was in her hand. She had every reason to leave, and nothing keeping her there except a man who'd just proven he wasn't worth it. That night, Michelle stayed. She would stay through more women, more lies, more nights wondering if Stanley was really at work or in someone else's bed. She would stay because leaving meant admitting she'd wasted 4 years on a man who saw her as useful, not irreplaceable. She chose him that night. She would keep choosing him for years. The choice that finally mattered, though, wasn't even hers to make. It was already speeding down a highway in Maryland, about to blow past a speed limit that would unravel everything. Alan Tate was 3 minutes from changing all their lives. The sedan with New York plates shot past the 2 Maryland state troopers at 73 miles per hour on a Wednesday morning in Elkton, 20 miles over the limit and about to end an empire. The 2 state troopers monitoring traffic that February morning had no idea they were about to trigger a federal investigation. They hit the lights and gave chase. The sedan slowed, pulled onto the shoulder, stopped. Alan Tate sat behind the wheel, watching in the rearview mirror as the first trooper approached. His hands shook when he reached for the registration. The trooper noticed. "License and registration, please." Alan fumbled with the glove box. It fell open. A small baggie of white powder tumbled onto the passenger seat. The trooper's eyes locked on it. "Step out of the vehicle." Alan's mind raced through his options. Run, lie, beg, but his body obeyed. He stepped out. The second trooper was already at the trunk. "Pop it." Alan hesitated. That hesitation told them everything. The trunk opened. Inside sat a black duffel bag. The trooper unzipped it slowly, like he already knew what he'd find. Bingo. Stacks of cash, digital scales, sandwich baggies by the 100. And beneath it all, wrapped in plastic and duct tape, 300 grams of crack cocaine. 300 grams of crack cocaine, the second trooper said into his radio. And those 6 words would echo all the way to Brooklyn. What started as a speeding ticket had just become a federal case. Al Tate, 27 years old, was looking at 10 to 15 years minimum under federal sentencing guidelines. 300 grams in a trunk. 140 miles from Brooklyn. 2 names that would unravel everything Michelle and Stanley had built. At the station, Alan sat across from a Maryland state investigator who laid out the math. Federal charges, mandatory minimums. No parole in the federal system. Unless Alan had something to trade. "Whose operation is this?" the investigator asked. Alan stared at the table. He thought about Stanley sitting in the Brooklyn trap house, counting money Alan had helped him make. He thought about Michelle packaging drugs while Stanley played her for a fool. He thought about loyalty, and what loyalty had ever gotten him besides a Maryland jail cell and a decade behind bars. He didn't owe them this. "I want a deal," Allen said. The investigator leaned back. "Then start talking." Allen gave them everything. The Brooklyn operation, the weekly routes, the trap house addresses, the packaging setup, and at the center of it all, 2 names. The feds would spend the next 2 years building a case around. "Stanley Burrell," Allen said. "He runs it. And Michelle Miles. She's his second." The investigator wrote both names down, underlined them twice, and reached for the phone. Allen didn't want to go down for someone else's kingdom. So he gave them 2 names, Stanley Burrell and Michelle Miles. The troopers called the FBI. The FBI called the NYPD. And in Brooklyn, the king and queen of Marcy projects had no idea their empire was already falling. The net was about to close slowly, carefully, over 2 years of surveillance that would document every move they made and every lie they told. The cameras appeared first, mounted at traffic lights around Marcy projects where they'd never been before. Lenses watching every corner, Stanley and Michelle controlled. The FBI agents assigned to the Joint Task Force had resources most street operations never saw. Unlimited surveillance, federal warrants. They installed cameras at intersections, tapped payphones Stanley's crew used, sent helicopters circling overhead at odd hours, rotors thumping low enough to rattle windows. Stanley noticed. He started changing where he slept every night, rotating between safe houses, never staying in one place long enough to establish a pattern. He told Michelle the heat was on him, not her. "The feds wasn't looking for me," Michelle would later explain. "They was looking for him." Stanley believed it too, or at least he said he did. But the task force wasn't just watching, they were building. Between 1995 and 1997, they arrested Stanley's crew one by one. Quarter boys, runners, lieutenants who'd worked the operation for years. Each arrest was surgical, targeted, designed to tighten the vice. The arrested associates came in one by one over 2 years, and every single one gave the same name when the pressure came. Stanley Burrell. Not Michelle, not anyone else. Just Stanley. Over and over, his name echoed through interrogation rooms in Brooklyn, Manhattan, Queens. The feds built their case the way you build a pyramid, base first, then layer by layer. Every testimony pointing up to the man at the top. Stanley went deeper underground. He stopped showing his face in Marcy projects. Stopped making runs.
And he was like, "Can I talk to you for a second?" And I was like, "Me?"
Again. Stanley finally spoke, voice low and calm. "They ain't got nothing. We good. No panic. No fear. Just that same steady reassurance he'd been giving her since Alan Tate got caught in Maryland. Since the cameras appeared. Since the helicopters started circling. The same confidence that had kept her believing she was safe when every sign screamed otherwise. Michelle wanted to believe him. Even now, sitting in the back of a federal vehicle with her hands cuffed and agents upstairs cataloging 7 years of evidence, she wanted to believe that Stanley knew something she didn't. But upstairs agents were photographing the logbook, counting the cash, bagging the photos, building a case that didn't need Stanley to say a word because he'd already written it all down himself. He told her they had nothing. Hours later, in a room with no windows, they would ask her to prove him wrong, and she would have to choose. The interrogation room door closed behind Michelle Miles with the finality of a vault-ceiling metal table. No windows, and one question she'd answer 3 different times. 2 federal agents sat across from her. Between them, a folder thick with evidence. They opened it. Photographs slid across the metal. Michelle recognized the images instantly, the trap house kitchen where she'd packaged crack for 4 years, the logbook with Stanley's handwriting, cash stacked on their bedroom dresser, her own face in photos with the crew. "You cooked it," one agent said. "You packaged it. You handled the money. You made the runs when Stanley was too hot to move." Michelle said nothing. The federal prosecutor handling the case had 17 years of drug conspiracy convictions and no patience for loyalty that looked like suicide. She leaned forward. "Alan Tate is cooperating. 14 other members of your crew are cooperating. We have the logbook. We have surveillance footage. We have 7 years of transactions in Stanley Burrell's handwriting." Paper slid across the table. "Federal conspiracy charges. Potential life sentence. You're looking at spending the rest of your life in prison," the prosecutor said. "Unless you cooperate." Michelle met her eyes. "Where we came from, we don't snitch." The evidence wasn't nothing. It was everything Alan Tate willing to testify. 14 associates ready to point at Stanley and Michelle. The logbook detailing 7 years of deals, photos proving the wealth they'd accumulated. Every choice Michelle had made since that first night in the Brooklyn trap house, all laid out on a metal table in a windowless room. They offered her freedom. "Tell us about Stanley's operation and walk out of here today." Michelle refused. Weeks passed. The public defender assigned to Michelle's case had seen this before, clients choosing prison over cooperation, and knew exactly how it would end. She came to Michelle's cell with a plea deal, reduced charges, testimony against Stanley in exchange for 8 to 10 years instead of life. Michelle refused. 3 times they offered her a door out. 3 times she chose a man who cheated on her, used her as a shield, and was going down anyway. Letters arrived from Stanley in his cell. His handwriting, the same neat script from the logbook that was destroying them both. "I love you. You're gonna be okay. They have nothing." Michelle held those letters like they were lifelines. The public defender tried one last time. "Michelle, he's not worth this. Save yourself. They thought they was gonna break me," Michelle would later say. And they didn't. She fired her public defender. That choice sealed everything. No plea deal, no cooperation, no testimony against Stanley. Just Michelle Miles. Facing a federal jury with a case so airtight her own lawyer had begged her to take the deal. She protected him with her silence, with her loyalty, with every choice that put him before her own survival. She protected him with everything she had. In 4 months, a federal jury would decide exactly how much that was worth. Neither of them knew that her sacrifice would save him nothing. The court clerk stood in a federal courtroom in February 1999 and read the verdict that would end 2 lives as Michelle Miles and Stanley Burrell knew them. The jury of 12 had spent weeks hearing testimony and reviewing evidence before reaching their unanimous verdict. They'd listened to Alan Tate describe the Brooklyn operation in detail. They'd heard 14 other associates corroborate every piece of it. They'd studied the 7-year logbook with Stanley's handwriting documenting thousands of transactions. They'd seen photographs of Michelle and Stanley and their crew flashing wealth that didn't come from legitimate work. The clerk opened the verdict form. "On the count of conspiracy to distribute heroin, we find the defendant, Stanley Burrell, guilty." Stanley's face remained blank. "On the count of conspiracy to distribute crack cocaine, we find the defendant, Stanley Burrell, guilty." No reaction. "On the count of conspiracy to distribute heroin, we find the defendant, Michelle Miles, guilty." Michelle's breath caught. "On the count of conspiracy to distribute crack cocaine, we find the defendant, Michelle Miles, guilty." Guilty on all counts. Despite Michelle refusing to testify. Despite her silence, despite firing her lawyer and protecting Stanley with everything she had. The jury convicted them both anyway because Allen and the others had given the prosecution everything it needed. Michelle's loyalty had been irrelevant. The federal judge presiding over the case had seen hundreds of drug conspiracy convictions and knew exactly what these sentences meant. He addressed Stanley first. Stanley Burrell, you orchestrated a drug distribution network that poisoned your own community for 7 years. You showed no remorse, accepted no responsibility. This court sentences you to life in federal prison. Life. Stanley stood motionless, his expression unchanged, as if the word meant nothing, as if he were watching this happen to someone else. The judge turned to Michelle. Michelle Miles, you were a willing and active participant in this conspiracy. You cooked the drugs. You packaged them. You distributed them. This court sentences you to 360 months in federal prison. 30 years. Michelle's knees buckled. Guards steadied her. How do I get 30 years in prison? How? The words came out broken, disbelieving. 30 years. 360 months. She was 27 years old, and if she served the full sentence, she'd be 57 when she walked out. Half her life given to a man who showed no emotion when the judge said life. The irony was devastating. Michelle had protected Stanley, refused to cooperate 3 separate times, fired her lawyer, chosen loyalty over freedom. And for what? Stanley got life anyway. Her silence hadn't reduced his sentence, hadn't bought him mercy, hadn't saved him from anything. The prosecution had built an airtight case without her testimony because 14 other people had chosen freedom over loyalty. Michelle had sacrificed 30 years for nothing. The gavel struck. Guards moved to escort them out. Michelle looked at Stanley one last time, searching his face for something. Regret, acknowledgement, gratitude for what she'd given up for him. His expression was blank, empty, like she was already gone. Her silence saved him nothing. It only bought her 30 years to think about why she gave it. Michelle Miles was about to learn how to save herself. Behind bars. Michelle Miles finally saw what she'd been too loyal to see for 7 years. Stanley Burrell was never going to save her because he'd never cared enough to try. The realization came slowly. Days turned into months. Months into years. Letters from Stanley still arrived, but the words felt hollow now. Empty promises from a man serving life 1 prison over who'd let her take the fall while claiming they had nothing. Somewhere in those years, a voice Michelle had ignored for too long finally broke through. This man is going to be the death of you. Not the death of her body, but of everything she could have been if she'd walked away that first night in the trap house. If she'd left when he cheated. If she'd taken the plea deal. If she'd chosen herself even once. Michelle stopped writing back. She spent 19 years in federal prison rebuilding what Stanley had destroyed. Not the empire, but herself. She took classes. She worked. She became the person the system said she couldn't be. And then in 2016, a letter arrived. Not from Stanley. Not from a lawyer. From President Obama's Clemency Project. Michelle held the paper in her hands, reading the words over and over. You are a prime example of rehabilitation. Therefore, I granted you clemency. 19 years. She'd served 19 of her 30-year sentence, and a president she'd never met was giving her back the rest of her life. She was 18 when she met him. She was 38 when a letter set her free, half her life spent for a love that was never coming to save her. Michelle walked out of federal prison in 2016 and built the life Stanley had stolen. Her own home. Meaningful work at a nonprofit helping formerly incarcerated people navigate the world outside bars. A healthy relationship built on respect, not control. She used her story as a warning. Don't date a drug dealer. Michelle told young women who reminded her of 18-year-old Michelle standing in that Brooklyn hallway. It only leads to prison, not love, not loyalty, not the empire Stanley promised her, just prison. Did any part of her, in all those years, know he was never coming to catch her and choose to stay anyway? No. Record answers that. Maybe none ever will. What matters is that Michelle Miles finally learned to save herself. And in doing so, she became the person who could help others do the same. Stanley is still serving life in federal prison. Michelle is free, using the years he took to build something he never could, a legacy that helps instead of destroys. Every king needs a queen. Stanley Burrell believed that when he pulled Michelle Miles into his Brooklyn empire in 1990, when he taught her to package drugs and count money, when he sent her on runs while he hid from the consequences. But when the throne finally crumbled, the king wasn't there to catch her, and the loyalty she gave to save him saved no one, while it cost her 30 years of her own. Michelle Miles walked out of federal prison in 2016 and became a voice for others caught in the same trap. Her story reminds us that love without self-preservation can become a cage, and loyalty to the wrong person can cost everything. This case shows the devastating ripple effect of drug crime, not just on communities poisoned by crack and heroin, but on people who believed they were building kingdoms when they
Because I was in love with him, I'm going to do what I can to keep him.
proves redemption is possible, even after losing decades to a choice made at 18. The lesson is, unforgiving but necessary blind loyalty is not love. When someone uses you as a shield, they've already decided your sacrifice is worth less than their survival. Michelle protected Stanley Burrell through every interrogation, and he showed no emotion when the judge gave her 30 years. Her story warns that the person who asks you to
So I went and got the gun.
risk everything should be willing to do the same for you. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and leave a comment. What struck you most about Michelle's journey? Have you ever had to choose between loyalty and self-preservation? Your perspective matters. Thank you for listening. This story is based on a real federal case, with some scenes dramatized to convey the emotional truth and lessons within. My deepest respect goes to everyone affected by drug crime, the families, the communities, and those rebuilding their lives after incarceration. May we all learn to recognize when loyalty becomes self-destruction.
They're coded, but they're not too hard to decipher.